And so moving on to the next slide, Alex highlighted a lot of key areas of opportunity, and we spoke about the funding need and where you can deploy capital. But we really want to make this real for the audience today. And so next slide. And so we are hoping to explore a lot of these themes that Alex talked about in greater length with our guests today. You'll hear from 3 funders who are actively investing in food waste solutions. 2 of those funders also happen to be solution providers themselves. And you'll also hear from 2 organizations that are really doing great work on the ground. And you can see visually, we're trying to cover the whole supply chain here, from prevention, rescue, and recycling. And we hope that this can provide a little bit of inspiration when it comes to you diving into food waste further. And so with that, I would love to introduce our first speaker today, Ida Posner, the founder and managing partner of Hawthorne Food Ventures, who will share her perspective when it comes to funding food waste solutions from a private capital side. But note that she has also done it from a philanthropic angle too. And so I'll pass it to you, Ida.
Thanks so much, Alejandro. Great to be with you all today. We can dive into the next slide. So as Alejandro mentioned, I've come at the food waste angle from it's been an evolution from a philanthropic perspective into venture capital. So I wanted to give a little bit of context for where I sit. So I first became aware of the challenge around food waste when I was working at the Pisces Foundation in San Francisco. And that was just around the time that ReFed was formed. And ReFed has really been an anchor partner throughout my entire journey with food waste. And I was able to bring some of that philanthropic work we were doing at Pisces with me when I took a new role with my family business. And so the Posner Foundation of Pittsburgh, where I serve as an advisor, is now a significant grant-making organization in food waste. And we've really been able to develop a strategic program in how do we really push the next level of how we're thinking about food waste investing from a philanthropic side. And that has been a really exciting and impactful journey. But I was coming back to the question of how do we really scale this? And as we just heard, it really is about that capital stack and thinking where is funding most needed? And importantly, as someone who really cares about this issue and believes that we can actually drive impact and make progress, how do you stay really at the front of this work and take a little bit of risk and think a little more creatively about how we can leverage capital in the best way possible? And so again, I'll mention that ReFed's really been a core partner throughout this entire evolution, and I'm now a very proud board member. So I will make many other shameless plugs for ReFed. You can go to the next slide. So you can read faster than I can talk. Here are a few of the key highlights of our investment thesis at Hawthorne Food Ventures. So at a very high level, what is Hawthorne Food Ventures? Venture capital for food waste solutions. We take a fairly broad approach to start, which is we're going to look at any food and ag tech company who have a food waste solution. Given the size and stage of our fund, we are looking earlier stage, mainly at seed and Series A, but we do look later stage when there are opportunities there. And in a less kind of jargony way of describing it, I want to be funding the best companies out there who are helping us solve food waste. Our core geography is North America focused, but we're open to looking outside of that as well. And then from an impact perspective, Hawthorne Food Ventures is market rate venture capital. And so if you think back to that slide where we were looking at the different financial return profiles of impact investing, we really do want to prove that these companies can be viable in the standard world of venture capital and really provide both a financial return and something positive for people and planet. So food waste has to be core to the company's value proposition or a co-benefit of what they are doing. And I like to think about this, that if you removed that food waste impact, the company just wouldn't be itself. And so it really has to be baked into the value proposition. And that second bullet point that's talking about either as its core value proposition or a co-benefit, the co-benefit category really widens what we can think about. And when we're living in this world where people have a lot of priorities and things that they are dealing with, food waste might not be their number one topic. But because it touches so many parts of our economy, of the environment, of human health, there's a lot of overlap with solution providers who may have a North Star that is something else, but the food waste angle is really strong, and we don't want to lose out on those opportunities. And then a couple other small things. We really prefer something that's going to have a physical product. You know, we're talking about food, we're talking about agriculture. And I'll get into this a little bit later, but a lot of venture capital has rightly been focused on software. It's really fast, easy to scale. And I think there's a gap in people really looking on the physical and digital physical hybrid side that might have a different timeline and return profile. You know, the question of, is venture capital suited for agriculture, always comes up. And I like to flip it and say, what does venture capital look like for agriculture? And how do we make that work in a sector that, you know, is moving at the pace of growing cycles, and an industry that is has a lot more history. All right, we can go to the next slide. So I think we'll keep coming back to the refed framework because it's fantastic. And actually, if you click one more time, my fabulous animation. These are the areas we are really focused on at Hawthorne Food Ventures. And as Alejandro had pointed out, if we're looking at food rescue, we really believe that that is a great area for philanthropic capital, and also has made a lot of progress in recent years as people are becoming more aware of the solutions out there for food rescue. So we really focus on prevention and recycling, and specifically areas of optimizing the harvest, enhancing product distribution, maximizing product utilization, and recycling anything remaining. The refined product management category, super interesting and exciting, and I think ties back to my earlier point on that tends to be largely a software play, and that's where we are seeing some capital being invested already. And so it doesn't have that, often have that physical products that we like to see. And in a really great way, VCs who might not be focused on food waste are paying attention there. Next slide, please. So this is our current portfolio, and you'll see a nice mix of companies in there, though their logos all play really nicely on the page together, so that's always nice to see. We have two companies that I'm going to go a little bit deeper into today in the on-farm food loss category, and then I'll just give a little summary of the other four. Strella is a company that is looking at produce freshness, and they have a sensor that can actually detect the ripeness of produce, bananas and apples, and track that downstream so your customer is getting a quality ripe product and you're reducing shrink in the supply chain. Hippo Harvest is an automated greenhouse company, and they have a fantastic leafy green with a shelf life of about 3 weeks. So that's starting to get at a lot of the loss that happens both in production, but also in your supply chain from production to the consumer. Banana is an upcycled snack company sourcing bananas and plantains in Ecuador that otherwise would go to waste and turning them into delicious, salty and sweet snacks. And then Mill is an at-home food recycling system, which is the most elegant food waste solution I have seen. We have one in our office. It's absolutely changed how we think about organics waste in the household and in an office setting. But again, today we're going to think a little bit more upstream at some of those prevention solutions, and specifically getting into on-farm loss. Next slide, please. So again, you can read faster than I can talk here, but I want to talk a little bit first about Clearleaf. Clearleaf has its main operations in Costa Rica and has a silver-based bactericide and fungicide. It can be applied pre and post-harvest, and this helps with on-farm disease control and then post-harvest spoilage. A couple things I want to highlight here. So the industry that this is competing against is the massive agrochemical industry that has a lot of nasty chemicals spraying all over your food. And that's not great for human health. It's also not great for the farm workers who have to be breathing in and touching all of these toxic chemicals every day. There are some regulatory tailwinds for trying to get these chemicals out of use, but they're also really effective. And so we have to find alternatives that are safe for people and the planet, but also work. And so that is where Clearleaf comes in. It is an effective solution that can be dropped in. And that's also a key point of these solutions. If you are introducing a different operating practice to a farm, that's a really heavy lift. If instead you can say, I have this product and you can put it in the same backpack sprayer that you've been using to use harsh chemicals, that's a little bit easier to start a conversation with a farmer. And so Clearleaf solution is one that can be implemented quickly, and it also can be produced at a price point that is comparable with some of those alternative solutions out there. And like any venture capitalist, obviously, when you're investing in an early stage company, you really want to think deeply about the teams you're investing in, about the people. Do they have the right skills and network and drive to really get this done? And after a really fantastic site visit to Costa Rica last year, we really gained a lot of confidence in the team. And so I just want to call that out. As anyone who's an investor knows, obviously, you do a lot of diligence to get up to the point of making an investment. And then after you, after you sign the documentation, you're in it for a long time. And so having that shared vision in the company is really critical as well. But again, the food waste connection here is we are trying to solve for all of the crops that are either never harvested because they have some kind of contamination or they're just completely wiped out, and then protecting those crops as they travel through the supply chain farther downstream. And if you go to the next slide, sometimes pictures are a little helpful here. So you'll see on the left that one container that's, well, I guess they're all green, that says Gota Blanca on it. That is the products that Clearleaf produces. And on the right are all of the chemicals that it can replace. So it's broad spectrum, can be applied to pretty much any crop. It's currently in many field trials. And again, it has that drop-in solution that allows it to operationalize quickly. And on the right, that is a photo from a coffee farm and just showing some of the plants that have already been started to be impacted by a disease that's much like rust. And if we take this back to the to the refed framework, we're trying to get at the 15% of waste that's of crops that are not harvested or spoiled. So there's a lot of impact there. Next slide, please. And in a similar category, another investment is Agrigene. And there's a lot of words on this slide, but essentially what Agrigene is doing is they are using sterile insect technology to breed male fruit flies who are not going to reproduce. And so if you have a crop that is infected with fruit flies and you release these genetically modified ones, they bring down the population. Why this is important is, again, often the only solution is to blanket spray massive fields, and you're putting a lot of harsh chemicals out into the environment. This is a more natural solution to think about how do we just reduce that pest population and avoid the losses that are happening. If you have any kind of infected pest population in a crop, that's all going to be rejected and all of that produce is going to be wasted. And it's a really motivating problem because we're working with farmers here who obviously are putting time and resources and energy into growing crops. And at the close to harvest point, if you have something go wrong, they're going to lose that entire field. And so with both Clearleaf and Agrigene, the value proposition is pretty clear, right? If we can improve yields and we can reduce loss, that is going to drop down to the bottom line of the farmer. And it's also just a very compelling way for people to think about how are we creating not just a food system, but a source of employment that's going to protect people, that's not going to cause a lot of human health problems. And at the end of the day, it's going to save you money. When we think about impact and the lens that we're taking with food waste, there's a lot of compelling narratives. And I think solutions that have more than one way to talk about it are going to be the ones that are the most compelling, both for people to invest in and also to adopt. And with Agrigene, I talked a little bit earlier about that kind of ease of application. You'll see the picture on the right. Essentially, you have this box with flies in it that are in their larvae stage. You leave it out in the field, they hatch and they're released. And so it's a super simple solution that is not going to add another operational hurdle for the farmers as well. So hopefully that helps a little bit to think about how we are looking at on-farm loss, and we'll save some time for questions later. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Ida. And that was a very helpful perspective of how a venture capitalist can look at the food waste landscape, and as well an overview of the theme of on-farm and that opportunity that we see today. One point that I do want to make clear that Ida was alluding to as well is this idea of her investing with the co-benefit of maybe reducing food waste. What we've seen is a lot of funders actually are not pure food waste funders, but rather they tackle the issue from various other angles, whether it's food access or if it's supply chain logistics. And then that just happens by existing to reduce food waste. So that's something to really flag for the audience here today. And so with that, I would love to introduce my other colleague and amazing speaker, Angel Veza of ReFed, who manages our Catalytic Grant Fund. And she will also be exploring 2 further companies that she's looked at in the past or invested herself. And so with that, Angel, take it away.
Thanks, Alejandro. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Angel Veza. I run our innovation initiatives at ReFed. And if we could go to the next slide. So you've heard ReFed talk a lot about that big 18 billion annual funding gap. And if you go to the next slide, Alejandro mentioned that a portion of that gap is this $5 billion needed in the form of catalytic funding. And so he mentioned this, when we talk about catalytic funding, we're talking about capital that's patient, risk tolerant, and flexible to allow it to unlock impact over time. And a significant portion of that really needs to come in the form of grant capital. And that's why we launched the Catalytic Grant Fund. So our fund focuses on opportunities where its funding and support can unlock that additional capital and impact by providing grants and post-grant support to initiatives with high impact potential as measured by food waste reduced, as well as greenhouse gas emissions reduced. If we go to the next slide. So since we launched the grant fund in 2022, we've established a portfolio of 16 grantees. And so I want to talk about what that portfolio looks like today. It covers all sorts of solutions because, as Alejandro mentioned, we need all types right now to solve this problem. And we're looking at prevention, rescue, and recycling. And for ReFed, we actually can fund both for-profits and nonprofits. I also want to call out that we aim to build a portfolio that reflects racial diversity among founders and leaders. And so to achieve this, we actually developed a DEIJ strategy and set a goal for 42% of our grantees to be led by non-white executive leaders, really reflecting the demographics of the United States. And so by implementing targeted strategies, we've consistently surpassed this goal with over 50% of our grantees led by diverse founders and leaders. So you go to the next slide. So I want to take a moment to talk about how our grant fund works. Essentially, it's a re-granting initiative. So we're continuously raising capital from donors, and then we deploy it through a series of open call cycles that are built around specific priority food waste themes that are rooted in ReFed's data analysis and subject matter expertise about where grant funding and innovation support is really needed. So as you can see here, our first open call was really focused on seeking solutions that could help consumers reduce food waste. And then our second open call was for solutions and initiatives that could reduce food waste in restaurants. If you go to the next slide, I want to take a moment to explain why we chose these specific themes. So we know food goes unsold and uneaten throughout the entire supply chain. We've highlighted that earlier, but we've noted that there's a large portion that's being wasted at the residential level. So that's why our first open call was really focused on consumers. Next, we saw that nearly half of the surplus generated by consumer-facing businesses comes from restaurants. And so this insight really shaped our second open call. Now, we're really focusing on a major opportunity at the farm level, which Ida talked about really well. And so our current open call aims to increase the harvest of surplus produce that's often left in the fields and get it to market. If we go to the next slide, please. So when reviewing proposals, we're always looking for initiatives that can have significant impact. And of course, we're looking for those opportunities where ReFed's funding and our unique support can be catalytic in unlocking that impact and additional funding. But other things we consider is whether or not this proposal is solving a real world problem for the customer. And I really want to focus on that because whether it's consumers or restaurants or farmers, that's the customer, there has to be a willingness to pay for the solution or initiative that we're looking at. And it could be money, but it could also be the labor and time that it takes to implement that solution. So there has to be a willingness to need this, and it has to be solving a problem. And as Ida mentioned, we also think about that, is it just a drop-in solution? So the way we talk about it is the initiative should be simple, convenient, and affordable to use or implement. And the experience should really be frictionless. And we think about this too in the sense of, how accessible is this solution, right? If we wanted to be helping consumers, we also want it to be affordable to demographics that might be lower income. When we think about restaurants, right, we want to make sure that these solutions are also accessible to the smaller independent restaurants and not just the larger chains. So we're looking for these initiatives that can really be accessible to all demographics. If we go to the next slide. So I want to highlight one grantee that, from our last open call focused on restaurants, that is an example of a solution that's really solving a problem for all types of restaurants. So many restaurants do struggle with ordering and inventory management, and sometimes this is due to having to meet minimum order requirements by suppliers. And what ends up happening is they order all of this food and they're storing it, but they aren't able to use it quickly enough before it goes bad. So Prism is this storage unit that has multiple compartments that can extend the shelf life of produce. And it really fits in with existing kitchen design, which is why it's so convenient for a lot of restaurant operators. And the way that these compartments work is actually customizable so that it is extending the shelf life of the produce within that compartment. Could be a leafy green, it could be a fruit, and it'll customize to that type of produce. Now, ReFed is Prism's first funder, and with our funding, they were able to pilot their prototype of these containers with several restaurants. And if you go to the next slide. And so our funding enabled them to really establish a business case and demonstrate their value to their core customer, which is restaurants. And they found that there is roughly a 9 to 12 month return on investment, but over time, a restaurant can save $2,000 to $3,000 annually just by decreasing the amount of orders they have to make on their products. So over time, we'll see a lot of the impact that these early milestones will achieve and the funding it will unlock. Now, I want to go to the next slide and talk a bit about kind of the unique thing that we are able to offer, which are recoverable grants. So 36% of our grants that we've distributed are recoverable. And a recoverable grant is similar to a typical grant, except that the grant agreement specifies that some or all of the funding will be recovered by the funder upon the happening of a certain event or a trigger. And that could be like achieving a certain milestone. Now, what would happen for the Catalytic Grant Fund is ReFed would take that recovered funding and then redistribute it in a future open call. So recoverable grants are really allowing us to amplify the impact of the funding from our donors. So if you go to the next slide. And so where are we at today? So in terms of the numbers, well, we're well on our way to reaching our 10 million target raise and are very excited to share that so far, the Catalytic Grant Fund has had a 15x multiplier effect, really enabling our portfolio to secure an additional $30.2 million so far. And we're really excited about that progress. And with that, I'm excited to introduce our two great solution providers that will be presenting today. First, we're going to be hearing from Moody Soliman at Ripe Labs. He is the founder and CEO of Ripe Labs. He's an experienced entrepreneur and startup founder with more than 18 years of experience in the medical device, biotech, and ag tech industries. And I've had the pleasure of seeing him pitch most recently, actually, at the Lineage Logistics Food Chain Innovation Challenge, where they won both the regional and global competitions, which is really exciting. So Moody, really happy to have you today, and I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much, Angel. Can you guys hear me okay? All right, excellent. Well, yeah, let's jump right into it. I'm going to share my screen here. As Angel mentioned, I'm Moody Soliman. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Ripe Labs, and really, it's a privilege to be here and have this opportunity to present to you one of the food waste solutions that's out there. And really, that is at the core of our mission, is to put an end to food waste. And so by now, I believe everybody on the call is quite familiar with the food waste and just the magnitude of this problem. And when we looked at it at Ripe Labs, we knew right away that if we were going to have a meaningful impact, we had to come up with a solution that was very easy to use, scalable, and can be adopted by the largest distributors down to the smallest smallholder farmers. And we believe that's exactly what we did by developing this plant-based, natural, organic compound that can be applied to almost any surface, including stickers. And so we apply this compound to the surface of the sticker where you see the branding here. You simply take that sticker, apply it to a fruit or a package of the fruit. It releases those natural bioactives and prevents premature rotting or slows down the premature rotting process. So as you can see here in this example, at about day 14, the non-treated mango starts to prematurely rot, while the treated mango is a lot more resistant to the premature rotting. Now, typically when people look at this, the first thing that comes to mind is, how in the world do you guys do this, right? It almost looks like magic. And there's actually some really robust science behind what we're doing. So plants have been producing these natural volatile compounds for millions of years. And so we simply turned to nature, look at these volatile compounds that plants release to protect themselves. So let's say right now you're sitting in a room and there's a lavender plant at the end of the other room. You'll smell it where you're sitting. This plant is releasing that scent for a variety of reasons, but one very important one is to actually protect itself. It has some antifungal properties in those compounds. And so what our plant physiologists and microbiologists do is they can identify the specific compounds that these plants release that tackle certain diseases that are found in post-harvest that are quite prevalent, such as botrytis or penicillium, for example. Then our chemical engineers and material scientists will take these very same compounds and develop what we call a controlled release matrix to encapsulate these compounds, then giving us a formula that we can apply to the surface of stickers, or we can introduce in the form of a sachet. And so essentially what we've really done is we've taken how plants have been able to protect themselves for millions of years, and we've repurposed it so that we can now extend the shelf life of fresh produce. Another way to look at it at the microbiology level, so taking you back to your high school biology class, those are 2 petri dishes. We've inoculated the 4 corners with a fungi that's quite prevalent in post-harvest produce. And as you can see here, one of the petri dishes has the sticker. And once again, you'll notice that the fungi in the petri dish without the sticker is growing. It's really nice. While where the sticker is placed, the fungi does not want to grow in that area or anywhere near the sticker. And again, everything we use is 100% natural and food safe and food grade. Now, the beauty of this technology is you can also apply it for berries. The good news is you don't have to apply a sticker on every blueberry or blackberry, for example. You could simply take the sticker, apply it to the package of the produce on the inside of the lid. It releases the bioactives and has very much the same effect. We are OMRI listed, so our technology can actually safely be used on organic produce, and the organic produce will maintain its organic certification. And so today, what we've really done is we've put together a suite of solutions, because really our goal is to be able to apply these solutions into the existing supply chain with minimal disruption. And that includes stickers that can go directly on fruits, larger stickers that can be placed on the packaging material, or even sachets for the larger boxes and packaging that's out there. Of course, it's important to differentiate ourselves from the other solutions that are out there. Not in any way putting down the other solutions, but really, this differentiation factor is key to being able to find the sweet spot and the product market fit. And so our differentiation factor is that we do not require direct contact. Again, the sticker can just be placed in the vicinity of the fruit and release these natural compounds. We directly inhibit fungal growth, whereas a lot of the solutions out there today are either preventing ripening by blocking the ethylene receptors, or preventing transpiration or respiration of the fruit by applying a coating to the fruit. It can be applied anywhere along the supply chain, and we can customize our delivery mechanism, which is really key. We're not a one-size-fits-all type solution. It really depends on the supply chain, on the needs of our customers. So behind this technology, as you can imagine, is a highly multidisciplinary team of chemical engineers, material scientists, plant physiologists, and microbiologists that really helped us bring this technology to market. And so speaking of bringing the technology to market, when we looked at the overall food waste market, it's really important for any startup, of course, to stay laser focused on a segment, at least to begin with, because if you try to do everything, you'll end up doing nothing. And so when we looked at just the food groups in general and where we saw the most wastage, it's typically around fruits and vegetables. So that's where we decided that we would really want to focus our solution. We also wanted to work with distributors and retailers, because that's where the supply chain becomes highly centralized. And in doing so, we've been able to work with customers all over the world with a real focus on Central and South America, because that's where we identified the early adopters are. That's where they export the produce. And by exporting the produce, of course, they are looking to, there are those breaks in the cold chain that enable us to apply our solution and add some value. Working with several household names in the industry, including the likes of Walmart that you're familiar with, and then others, of course, like Redcliffe that are distributors to the Walmarts of the world. When we introduced our solution, we've had anywhere from 40 to 100% shelf life extension on blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, and strawberries. So really short shelf life, high value type produce. We've also had some excellent results on mangoes, citrus, avocados, etc. And with Walmart in Costa Rica, for example, we added anywhere from 2 to 4 days to the shelf life of their strawberries, which is significant by retail standards. So our business model is quite simple. It's direct sales of our shelf life extension solutions. At scale, we're going to be looking at licensing out the formulation, working with these label makers, because we're not a sticker manufacturer at the end of the day. We specialize in the formulation. Volume-based pricing with 50 to 88% margins. And then we actually commercially launched in Q3 of last year with a focus on Latin America and Japan, where we found the early adopters, and looking at a break-even point in Q3 of 2026. Many benefits for this type of solutions, as it's been covered in past talks, but increasing the revenue, reducing the costs of resorting, repackaging, and of course the waste itself, enhancing the reputation of our customers by supplying fresh produce, increasing supply chain flexibility and opening up new markets, as well, of course, as last but not least, reducing the carbon footprint because of the environmental impact. Lastly, just to put things in perspective, for every $100,000 worth of ripe lab solutions that are out there, we can prevent 281 tons of food from ending up in landfills, save over 155 tons of greenhouse gases, and our customers can see up to 300% ROI. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll look forward to the question and answer session after the rest of the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Moody. That was excellent. Next up, I'm really thrilled to be introducing Joe Robbins, the Chief Product Officer at Food Rescue US, which is one of the grantees of the Catalytic Grant Fund. Joe has extensive experience leading technical and product development teams and has been doing a great job leading an initiative that we funded to make donating food simpler for restaurants. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Joe.
Hey, thank you so much, Angel. Good morning, everyone. My name is Joe Robbins. I'm the Chief Product Officer with Food Rescue US. My plan here is to tell you about the work that we do, how we fund that work, and the challenges that we're currently facing. I was so excited to hear about this ReFed series and even more excited to be asked to participate. And my hope is that this presentation will act as a case study of sorts for the ideas and concepts y'all have been learning about over the course of this series. And with that, I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. Let's see. There we go. So Food Rescue US is a food recovery organization that has been operating since 2011. And our model is very simple. We use volunteers to rescue food from businesses that have a surplus and deliver that food to agencies that support the community. We use local networks of volunteers who conduct these food pickups in their personal vehicles and coordinate all of this through a proprietary software application that we develop in-house. Because we have this decentralized direct transfer model, the vast majority of our deliveries get this food from the donor to the agency in less than 30 minutes, which means that we're able to rescue prepared food and food types that are often overlooked by traditional recovery models. Now, the overall concept is quite simple, but the scale and reach of our model is significant, as you'll see on the next slide here. We currently operate across 43 recovery sites in 22 different states and the District of Columbia. If you take one thing away from these webinars, it should be that the problem of food insecurity is incredibly complex and incredibly local. No two communities face the same issues in the same way. And what makes our model so scalable is that each site is made up of volunteers, donors, and agencies that are part of the community they're helping to serve. We develop tools and training, but we let each site evolve around the needs of their community. And this approach has worked incredibly well, as you'll see on the next slide here. Our work has made a considerable impact. In 2024 alone, we completed over 132,000 rescues, which provided more than 31 million meals to food insecure individuals. That's a lot of food that avoided the landfill, and using ReFed's impact calculator, we estimate that our work offset over 50,000 tons of CO2 equivalent just in the last year. So to summarize, a simple model that scales really well and generates significant impact. And now I want to talk about how we fund all of that. So this slide shows a breakdown of our funding sources. You can see that grants and fundraising make up over half of our revenue, with individual donors contributing about a third of that revenue. We also receive support from corporations, many of whom are also food donors, and generate some revenue by licensing our software to smaller recovery organizations. Each of these revenue sources has unique challenges. Fundraising events, for example, are labor intensive, and there's a limit to how often we can engage with donors without creating burnout. Individual donors are fantastic, but require significant time and dedicated attention before they even make their first donation. And grants, while critical, can often restrict our ability to stay agile if they aren't structured correctly. Many come with extensive commitments that make it harder to adapt quickly to shifting food systems or legislative landscapes, or simply when our first solution isn't the best possible solution. In product development, you typically build, measure, and iterate in loops based on the real-time feedback you're getting for your customers. But grants can often require us to commit to a predefined solution months in advance, which puts a limit on our ability to be reactive and iterative in our approach. So all of these challenges have solutions, and I'm going to get to those in a moment. But first, I want to talk about where we actually spend the money we work so hard to raise. I want to start by emphasizing just how efficient our model is. For every dollar that we spend, we deliver about 16 meals. So if you've been to the grocery store recently, you know how remarkable that number is. For our budget breakdown, about 50% of that goes to staff, 36% to the day-to-day operation of our sites, about 13% to app development, and about 2% goes to marketing and recruitment. That 50% for staffing is vital because our work is so deeply relational and people-driven. We have site coaches who train our volunteers. We're constantly recruiting new volunteers and food donors. We develop the software, we fundraise, and we market. All of these things require the time of dedicated, talented people. And despite this, staffing is one of the most difficult areas for us to fund. Many grant funders, understandably, are hesitant to support overhead, even though it's our biggest need. So that has long been one of our biggest bottlenecks in terms of growth. But now is the part where I can tell you about what we're doing to solve these issues. First of all, there's a large and growing market for corporate sustainability solutions. The sustainability software market hit $3 billion in 2024 and is projected to grow by 16% annually as more companies make carbon commitments and more investors are looking at sustainability as a risk factor. We believe that there's a real market out there for out-of-the-box sustainability solutions that can be packaged with existing software platforms. And our partnership with Toast on the donor link that was made possible by the ReFed Catalytic grant is a pilot test of sorts in that regard. Beyond the sustainability element, the tax incentives for donated food would give a software provider that offers their customers a ready-to-go solution like ours a significant competitive advantage, and one we believe there's a market for. We've also been working with a third-party validator for over a year in hopes of generating and selling carbon credits based on our methane offsets. And in the next 6 months, we expect to be minting and selling high-quality carbon credits based on our existing rescue work. The market for carbon credits has shifted dramatically in the recent years towards higher quality credits with compelling impact stories, and we believe we're really well positioned to lead in that space. Another opportunity lies in municipal bonds. In 2024, $507 billion in bonds were issued by municipalities around the country, and investors are increasingly evaluating sustainability risks and mitigation strategies when choosing bond packages that they're buying. We're currently collaborating with a research team from Bard College to assess this market and identify market fit. And we've been using data from the Carbon Disclosure Project to identify municipalities whose climate surveys indicate rising food insecurity is a risk. We plan to begin offering our solution directly to these cities as an extension of our existing licensing program. And lastly, we're testing a new approach to grants. We're planning to start building innovation windows, allocating 5 to 10% of grant funds to address specific problems instead of locking in predefined solutions. The idea with that is that we can build in the flexibility we need in order to be innovative. And by reporting the results of this innovation back to grant funders, we can build the trust needed for these funders to partner with us against problems and be more flexible in our search for solutions. So in closing, Food Rescue US is uniquely positioned to address food insecurity and climate change while creating scalable and sustainable solutions. And I hope this example helps paint a picture of the types of challenges and solutions that are present in the minds of nonprofit organizations like ours. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions in the question and answer period.
Thank you for that, Joe. And so we've heard from two examples of really interesting innovations that solve the food waste problem. Joe was talking about food rescue and how nonprofits are doing it. And Moody talked about a shelf life extension technology that works across the supply chain to reduce waste in that way. And to summarize, Angel provided a very good overview of how grant making for both for-profits and nonprofits can be done for food waste solutions. And so to conclude this conversation, I would like to highlight the importance of infrastructure because that is something that will allow us, like across the supply chain, to better handle the waste that is being created. And so who better to discuss that than our partners, well, our friends, Closed Loop Partners, and their Center for Circular Economy. So Caroline is joining us today, and she leads their composting work, which aims to support US composting infrastructure and hopefully grow it from where it is today. And so with that, Caroline, take it away.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. It is such a pleasure to be here. First and foremost, can everyone hear me all right? Am I coming through loud and clear? Perfect. Thank you. I'm Caroline Berry. I am the program manager of Closed Loop Partners Composting Consortium. Today, I am here to talk about how capital can scale food waste composting infrastructure in the US. Next slide. And you can jump ahead one more slide, Hannah. Thank you. Perfect. So Closed Loop Partners is at the forefront of the circular economy, and we have 3 business verticals that focus on investment, innovation, and operating. Our operations arm, Closed Loop Builders, is the largest privately held recycling company in the US. Our capital management firm consists of venture, growth, buyout, and catalytic portfolio funding with more than $550 million in assets under management. And finally, our innovation group, known as the Center for the Circular Economy, brings together the world's largest retailers, consumer goods companies, material science companies to tackle complex material challenges and implement systems change to advance circularity. I sit on the innovation team, so that's the lens through which I'll be speaking today. Next slide. Great, thanks, Hannah. So the Composting Consortium is one of several initiatives within the center. We convene leading and diverse voices across the entire composting ecosystem, whose names and logos that you see here on the screen, in order to enable the recovery of food waste. Our shared mission is to advance the growth of organics infrastructure in the US and increase the recovery of food scraps and food contact compostable packaging. Next slide. So this slide kind of captures and distills the history of food waste composting in the US, which is relatively nascent compared to yard waste composting. Our research shows that there are about 200 full-scale commercial composting sites in the country that take food waste, and that number has been growing steadily over the last few years. There is a growing number of composters who are eager to play a role in the food waste solution. However, it's estimated that only about 4% of all the food that is wasted in the US is composted. By comparison, we're looking at about 2,700 full-scale compost sites that take yard waste or green waste. So that infrastructure gap really presents this critical and exciting opportunity for investors to start thinking about how can we be diverting more food waste from landfill towards a beneficial use like composting. Next slide. Through our research, the Composting Consortium has found that a blended financing framework can help catalyze scale in existing composting infrastructure and bring traditional capital sources to the table. So when we talk about a blended capital framework, we're referring to the 3 financial levers that you see here on the screen. That's grants and philanthropic funding, patient and flexible capital, also known as catalytic capital, which Angel spoke to earlier, and private equity. Next slide. Blended capital is effective in that it strategically combines public and private capital with different risk tolerances. For example, if we're thinking about unlocking new markets, blended finance can be used to pilot emerging composting technologies or food waste collection programs in new regions. So initial investments from public or philanthropic sources can really help demonstrate the feasibility of these types of projects and prove the environmental and economic benefits. This in turn can pave the way for larger scale private investment to unlock new markets for composting infrastructure. Next slide. Okay, so understanding the composter business model is a critical first step in the investment strategy. And something we've observed over the last few years since getting our start in this space is that the business model is not often widely understood. So it is true that really there are no two composter business models that are alike. There is really no standardized facility setup. However, there are general commonalities about the inputs, the processes, and the outputs that connect the sector. So I'm going to spend a minute or two on this slide and just walk us through some of those commonalities, which I think are really relevant and important for today's audience. At the highest level, there are two types of composters. We have the processor and the hauler processor. A processor owns and operates a facility, and they receive their inbound feedstock from an external party, whereas a hauler processor is vertically integrated, meaning they collect the feedstocks, they transport them back to their facility, and then they process the materials on site into compost. And also worth noting, compost manufacturers can be municipally owned and operated, privately owned and operated, or a combination of the two. As a general best practice, composters are making about 75% of their revenue off of tip fees and about 25% off of product sales. Tip fees are the charges for accepting organic waste that is dropped at their site. So if you look to the composting facility illustration here, you'll see in the bottom left corner a depiction of material getting tipped at the site, and then kind of a flow chart walking you through the composting process. Typical net profit margins for composters ranges from about 6% to 8%. And that cash flow for running operations predominantly comes from fees and sales revenue, like I mentioned. The composting process itself can take anywhere from a few weeks to a few months, depending on the technology. This specific illustration is meant to depict an aerated static pile facility, also known as ASP. This is the fastest growing technology in the industry. More composters are shifting from traditional windrow to ASP due to faster processing times. The main cost drivers for composting facilities are important to note. Those are labor, contamination management, and machinery purchase or upgrades. In fact, the cost of machinery has risen exorbitantly over the last 5 years. The industry has seen a 4x increase in the cost of equipment like trommel screens and depackagers, just to name a few. Now, those costs are specific to running a facility, but there are also costs to consider for siting and building facilities. I mentioned previously on a prior slide that there is this immense opportunity to be retrofitting yard waste facilities to take food waste. However, those costs are highly variable and dependent on the regulatory and permitting landscape of where that composter is located. In a similar vein, greenfield investments can vary widely from $1 million to $20 million with very long lead times. So siting a facility is very dependent to the state or locality. The flip side of all those challenges is that we're seeing an increased attention from state and federal agencies mandating organics recycling in their jurisdictions. So these types of policies and strategies are creating real tailwinds for the expansion of composting infrastructure that can handle food waste. Okay, I know that was a lot, but hopefully some helpful context. Next slide, Hannah. All right. So I just talked us through some of the challenges around infrastructure build, like long lead times and capital intensity. This slide is meant to capture some of the financing opportunities for new infrastructure. I won't speak to every single example here, but maybe just to highlight one interesting and powerful example is place-based investors. So as the name suggests, place-based investors are often focused on opportunities to support the growth of a critical local industry. And because they have that vested interest in the long-term health and sustainability of their communities, they're well positioned to provide patient catalytic capital for, say, a small to mid-sized composting facility in their region. Next slide. Another opportunity is innovation. The composting industry is ripe for innovation, especially when thinking about how to solve for contamination, which is irrefutably composters' greatest challenge, very similar to the recycling industry. Our in-market research has found that on average, about 21% of a composter's operating costs are spent on managing contamination. This presents a real opportunity for traditional venture capital to invest in startups that might be developing new advancements or technology. Additionally, philanthropic dollars can go a long way in supporting early stage research. Next slide. Okay, and last but not least, end market development for finished compost also faces its own sets of challenges and opportunities. As it stands today, one such example is long-term offtake agreements are less common in the composting industry compared to the recycling industry. And oftentimes the lowest cost financing options are reserved for operators who have secured those long-term purchases and customers for their finished compost, their finished product. So blended capital can help pilot new composting applications by securing those offtake agreements. All right, next slide. Yeah, that closes us out. I just want to say thank you so much for your time and attention, and thank you, Refit, for the invitation today. And if you want to learn more about any of the topics I just breezed through, I'm happy to share a link to our investment report, but I look forward to the Q&A in just a moment here. Thanks all.
Awesome. So thank you, Caroline, and thank you all the speakers for providing your perspectives on the issue. I think it goes without saying you're all subject matter experts within your own realm. And so I love the fact that we have the opportunity today that the audience can ask you questions too. The chat box has been very active. And so I'd invite all speakers, if you could turn on your cameras, and I'd bring you all onto the stage, at least the virtual stage. And so to kick it off, knowing that a number of funders that are on the line actually are not specifically food waste funders. They're coming at it from a different angle. The question is, what do you wish other climate funders or other food funders knew? Maybe about the topic of food waste or just in general, what do you wish they knew? And what's been successful in getting those funders into the ring?
I can start here. So I talked a little bit about this. Most people already have an investment thesis, an area of focus, or many. And so while I think food waste is one of the most compelling issues to work on of our time, I also understand that might not be the case for everyone. So I like to think about overlaps of where food waste touches what they might already be looking at. And so from a climate perspective, I think the methane conversation has really come into focus in recent years as what do we need to do in the next few years, in addition to thinking about long-term carbon, but what do we really need to do in the next few years to pull that emergency brake to really make some progress and slow the change we're seeing. So that's a great way to start talking about food and agriculture in the climate community. When I am talking with funders who don't have the environment or the climate as a priority, food waste is actually still a great topic. We always say it is a nonpartisan issue. No one is out there saying we should be wasting food, right? And so there are a lot of economic, public health, and just social benefit reasons that really provide for a lot of overlap. And then the third piece of this is value capture. And again, if we are sending food to landfill, if we're not using it, that's leaving money on the table. So when I'm talking to someone who is really just financially motivated, it's about how do we capture those resources that aren't waste until we throw them away.
Thank you. And I'd actually want to turn this question maybe to Joe, because I think he would have a very interesting perspective from rescue, given that a lot of that tends to be from a hunger relief angle. But Joe, how do you bring people to this issue, if at all?
Yeah, I'll say that hunger is an issue that is not difficult to understand. It's something that strikes home for everybody. It's an issue that's existed for forever. And I think the biggest issue we have in terms of funder awareness are really understanding the impacts of a simple model. I think that a lot of folks are quickly captured by kind of the newest shiny thing. And I think that sometimes a really simple solution, people who are in your community who are retired and have free time, like their efforts volunteering for an hour every week can really add up to a huge amount of impact. So I think that's the thing I would highlight, was really not underestimating the impact of community engagement.
That makes sense. And maybe I'll go to Caroline, given both you're a funder, but you also support composting. How have you brought people to this issue?
Yeah, it's a great question. I love how Ida mentioned food waste as like a non-partisan issue. I think the same concept applies when thinking about composting and organics recycling. For me, it depends on who I'm talking to. I'll often highlight the opportunity and connection to enhanced soil health and soil resiliency, which I think is such an important piece of the picture that often, maybe not often, but perhaps maybe overlooked depending on who you're talking to. But also the economic opportunity to be had by transitioning away from landfill and focusing on other end-of-life opportunities like composting, like recycling, like AD, whatever it may be. And that economic piece, as you might imagine, is really something that ties together the entire thesis behind closed loop partners, because everything that we do, whether we're talking about investments, operating, or innovation, it has to come back to the circular economy.
That makes sense. And actually, I'm going to put some of the funders on the line, on the spot a little bit, given that we want to be able to demonstrate for people here how one can fund food waste solutions. And so it's going to be Ida, Caroline, and Angel. What are ways, like what is part of your diligence process? How do you dive into companies? And so maybe I'll first ask Angel to opine, and then I'll call on others.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, as you know, we do things through a series of open calls. So we have set selection criteria for our grant fund that are unique to that open call, but the categories typically fall around that impact potential, as well as also that catalytic funding potential. You know, will we be able to unlock impact with our unique funding? So we look at that strategic fit a lot in terms of that funding request, and if ReFed's the right funder for this opportunity. And then Ida mentioned this, we look at team also. That's a big part of that. And for us, because we look at some new ideas, new initiatives, we'll also, you don't need to already be established. We'll look at your organizational track record or your experience, and we'll take that into consideration as well. But those other pieces too that I mentioned earlier, in terms of, is there demand for what you are offering? Is this going to solve a real world problem? Is the user actually going to implement it? And if you are using predictive analytics, actually going to take those insights and do something with it? And so we'll dig into that by actually talking to customers, partners, and funders, and do that deep due diligence to understand how this solution or initiative is really being used in real time.
And that point about where, like, is there actually demand for that end product is really valuable. And that's why maybe I'll point this question out to Caroline, because I think there's some parallels there. How do you diligence companies, especially composters?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And again, I'll caveat this by saying I'm coming from the innovation side of the house, not necessarily the capital management side, but I can share from a high level perspective what some of our capital management teams might be looking at. It's not so dissimilar from what Angel was saying if we're looking at our ventures group. So predominantly, they're looking at market differentiation. There has to be that differentiation factor, and really to kind of catch their attention. Strategic fit and team are also a critical part of the process. And at the risk of sounding redundant, circularity, it's all about the circular economy. So we have to provide that proof point there. If you're looking at another kind of branch of our capital management team, such as our closed loop infrastructure group, they're going to be taking a slightly different lens, right? They provide below market rate loans to recycling infrastructure. oftentimes they're looking at the emissions story. In the context of composting, I know that they've shared with me they're a bit more interested in centralized composting when thinking about the hierarchy of solutions. And something else they have to think about a lot is really the biggest drivers for recycling and composting, which is often property. That's something I alluded to in my presentation, but just thinking about what are going to be the most critical needs for financing and how that plays into our existing portfolio. I think that's all very relevant, but variable depending on which aspect of our capital management team you're talking about.
Thank you, Caroline. And then to take it home, Ida, anything specific that you look at that would be related to food waste and maybe not necessarily to other companies when it comes to diligence?
Yeah, and I will emphasize again the team. The earlier stage you're looking at, the more important the team is, in my opinion. As much as possible, I want to go talk to a customer, and that can be a little sticky with some companies because that's you have to be pretty far along the diligence process. But if you can talk to a customer, preferably without the founder in the room, you're going to figure out what's really going on. And doing site visits, like really immersing yourself into the context that these founders are working in is really important. And I'll share one specific example. So Strella is now based in Seattle. The founder, Katya, who's incredible, she was doing her PhD at Penn, moved the company to Seattle because they're working with apple growers and like they need to be in Seattle. And so being with her, going on site visits with her customers and getting to talk to the customers, getting to see how she interacts with them and the respect that they have for her, for the effort that she's put in to learn the industry. If you're working in agriculture, you can't just come in as, I'm a tech founder with a solution, please listen to me, right? You have to earn that respect. It's a different environment than I think a lot of the companies that might just be really centered in Silicon Valley and not seeing outside of that. So I think context really matters, talking to customers matters. And then the final thing is, we all like to think that people will do things because they're good for the world, and a small group of people will, but the majority of people are going to be faced with the reality of, trying to get through the day. And so thinking about, is this a solution that can last beyond the early adopters who are doing this just because they care?
Thank you, Ida. And so I actually want to take this conversation a different direction to go towards the innovators here that are doing a lot of the work on the ground. We have a lot of high-level questions, but let's start with the very specific, because I think there's a number of people in the chat that are still getting to know the food waste topic. And so my first question is for Ripe Labs. Moody, I know you answered this question in the chat, but I think it's helpful for others to know about this too. Has there been any research done to test nutritional content density? I know you're extending shelf life, but does your solution also help with nutritional density as well and extending that?
Yeah, thank you, Alejandro. That's a great question. So although we haven't done any in-house testing, there is quite robust studies that have been done that have shown that by slowing down the premature rotting process, you are also slowing down the degradation of nutrients. It's an indirect effect, but there's definitely an overlap there. And it just touches on one of the things that is really important to highlight when we're coming up with these solutions. And I think Ida, I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent here, but it's really important to highlight because I think Ida touched on it, that when you're developing these types of solutions, these product-based solutions, it is indeed not like software, and it has a completely different timeline, and you're working with highly complex products. I mean, that fruit is literally breathing in oxygen and letting out carbon dioxide. It's a living organism with an immune system. And so when we develop these solutions, it does operate on a completely different timeline from what you see out there with the software companies and perhaps other companies that the investors may be more familiar with. But yeah, to go back to that question, there is definitely an overlap, although it's an indirect one.
Okay, that makes sense. And this one's actually for Food Rescue US. So Joe, there's a number of questions around just the rescuing process. So one is, when it comes to rescuing, can you address the liability issue? And I know this is like an important thing in the US market, liability issue when it comes to collecting that waste or food to redistribute.
Yes. And I have to start by saying I'm not qualified to give legal advice. So take what I say here with a grain of salt. But yeah, I would encourage you to look into the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Act. It's a piece of federal legislation that provides really all-encompassing, broad-based protections for any food donors that are donating food inventory, with the intent that that food inventory is going to be consumed. Again, I can't speak to the liability specifically, but that piece of legislation provides really broad protections for that. And so I think that typically becomes a liability issue for the receiving agency, and receiving agencies that we work with are vetted to make sure that they are paying attention to things like time and temperature control. The issue with food being contaminated with bacteria comes down to time and temperature control. And because we have such a quick turnaround time for the deliveries themselves, that becomes less of an issue with prepared food. I mentioned in the presentation how difficult traditional recovery models have with prepared food. A lot of food banks do a lot of work with canned goods, things that are shelf stable, have a really hard time providing more nutritional options. And so something that with a quick turnaround time for delivery can really reduce the amount of liability they incur there.
Okay, that makes sense. And Joe, one other question for you, and I think this is probably related to all rescue in general. When it comes to food that you rescue, how do you take into account once you distribute that food to those that are beneficiaries, if they're going to use that food or if that's going to go to waste?
Yeah, this was a very insightful question, and this is an issue that we see for sure. The biggest driver of this issue is that these receiving agencies are often taking any food that they can get from any angle. And so the problem is they will get, 100 pounds of onions, and they've got to figure out what to do with 100 pounds of onions in the next couple of days. And so one thing that our app does is allows for data-driven decision-making in terms of the person actually making the routing decision. So the receiving agencies can put in what types of food they're looking for within a given time period, and then we're able to route food to them that they know that they'll be able to actually use. So we're able to mitigate that risk. I will say we're hoping to partner with an academic institution later this year to actually conduct a study into this exact issue. And something else that we're doing is we have a program called Fridge the Gap, which is a grant program that actually supports receiving agencies in purchasing cold storage facilities and tools. So that's something else that can help kind of reduce the issue with waste at the deliveries point. I will say to Gideon's question, the numbers I reported are the numbers that we track through the app. And so that counts food that we deliver. Some of that food is definitely wasted at the receiving agency point. We have several features in play that help to mitigate that risk.
That makes sense. And I know we're getting close to time. I'm going to try to squeeze in 3 questions that might be ambitious. But one topic that was brought up yesterday was the impact of food waste as it relates to beef, because it's such a high emissions product. And so this question is actually directed to ReFed, and so I'll send it to Angel. They're wondering if ReFed has identified any specific solutions that can address this issue of beef.
That's a really great point and a great question. I will say we are doing work to better understand the loss and waste that's happening specifically in the beef supply chain. I do believe, and there are colleagues that can probably correct me on this, but when we're looking at beef, most of the methane emissions is really coming from enteric emissions. So that, and manure. And so that's actually where the bigger opportunity is. We're not sure yet how food loss and waste fits in within the beef industry. So we do expect to have some things to share on this over the course of this year, probably by the end of the year. We're doing a lot of work with the U.S. Food Waste Pact to do a study on this. And then hopefully we'll be able to elevate some real funding opportunities on this and host an open call actually to address this really based on those findings.
Awesome. Thank you, Angel. And okay, I think I only have time for one more question. I'll do 1.5. And this is going to be for Joe and Moody. Because there are a number of funders on the line, I'd love to ask you, what has been helpful for a funder in terms of what has been catalytic in allowing you to progress your businesses further? And I'll start with Moody first.
Yeah, so I think really working with funders that understand the space has been absolutely key. So that word, catalytic funding is really critical for companies in our space. because oftentimes you need that first investment to come in, put the term sheet on the table, and then the rest of the investors will follow. Right. So it usually starts with an investor that's really familiar with the space, understands some of the nuances of the timeline and the type of patient capital that needs to be put into this company. And then this will help attract the rest of the investors to follow.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there, and I don't want to be accused of brown nosing here, but I think the ReFed Catalytic grant was an excellent example of a process that really utilized the knowledge of the funder to kind of help us come up with a solution that was going to be impactful, and a solution that kind of met us on our terms. We have a great idea and we have the ability to implement that. And sometimes in the course of that, we have to pivot and figure out kind of what the best solution is going to be for the fit. And so sometimes that iterative process is hard to conduct within the grant making cycle. But a funder that knows the issues that we're up against and is able to work with us and talk through the problem, as opposed to just kind of the milestones for a given solution, is really critical to the success of the project.
Okay, and so with that, I would love to thank all our brilliant speakers today. You brought really interesting points. And before I hand it back to Hannah at Project Drawdown and bring a webinar to a close, I wanted to thank you all again for just really diving into this topic of food waste. It's been a long haul. 3 sessions is a lot. And so additionally, if you're interested in learning other ways to get involved in food loss and waste, I'd highlight 4 opportunities to keep the conversation going. So next slide. And those opportunities are: join the Food Waste Funder Circle. That's one way where you can really dive deeper and learn about the topic. ReFed facilitates that, and it is a free network. Additionally, if you are interested in one-on-one capital advisory support, ReFed is happy to help you on your journey to see where you can really be more impactful. These sessions are not meant to be learn and that's it. I think this is a first step, and if you want to learn more, please reach out to us. Some contact information is going to be showing up in the chat. Nextly, if you're interested in the regranting fund that Angel talked about, that's another avenue. If you're not into like direct investing, you've heard from various other funders here today that are doing that funding. And so if you want to reach out to them, feel free to. And then lastly, we are hosting a Food Waste Solutions Summit this summer, and that's a real gathering of those that are in the ecosystem and all the actors, so that we can coordinate further action. And that's a really good event that I'd highly recommend others to attend. And so with that,